In this sewing tips video, I'm sharing an easy way to create tons of bias tape from one square of fabric. Yes, this is a well-known hack, but I wanted to try it for myself to see if it actually worked. Spoiler alert, it does. First, I took a large rectangular cut of fabric and folded down one corner, lining up the bottom and side edges. It will look like a dog-eared page from a book. You do need to make sure all sides are squared up. That means the sides and top and bottom are parallel to each other. All corners should form a 90-degree angle. Then I lined up a long quilting ruler against the folded over edge and cut with a rotary blade. This will create a square no matter what size your fabric is. Having the piece folded on the diagonal made the next step easy, cutting the fabric on that line to create two triangles. This diagonal cut was longer than my 24-inch ruler, so I had to work in two sections. Now I'm matching up two of the shorter sides to form a slanted rectangle shape. Place right sides together and pin every couple inches. Because I'm sewing with a 1/4-inch seam, I made sure to overlap the pieces by the same amount. If you don't do this, the pieces won't be lined up correctly after stitching them together. Sew the seam the entire way, back stitching at the beginning and end. If you're really new at this, I recommend watching my sewing machine basics videos to get acquainted. Take it to the ironing station and press the seams open. The two longer sides will be cut on the diagonal, also known as the bias. Now comes the interesting part. Figure out how wide you want the tape to be. I'm going with 2 inches because I'm going to use it for a specific sewing project. Starting from the bias cut edge, measure and mark lines every 2 inches. You'll know it's the right edge on printed fabric because the design will be diagonal and not up and down. Normally I use an air-soluble marking pen, but this time I went with a longer-lasting water-soluble pen because I needed the lines to stick around for a while to cut them. Again, I worked in sections to account for the fabric being longer than my ruler. This part took some time because I wanted to be extra careful my lines were accurate. I also had to continually shift around the fabric. When you get to the other edge, there will most likely be excess fabric beyond the last mark that's not wide enough for the tape. That's okay, you'll just be discarding that extra strip at the end. You should have something like this. Next, I'm going to be creating a tube out of the fabric. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. You will need to overlap the lines by 1 row in order to be able to cut a continuous piece of bias tape, sort of like a corkscrew. Place shorter edges right sides together like I'm doing. Lining up the fabric will feel a little odd because the edges don't naturally fit together. It's kind of awkward like sewing curves. The lines you marked will be perpendicular to each other while pinning, but will be straight after sewing. Start pinning every few inches and keep checking as you go that the lines are positioned where you want them. Yes, the tube looks twisted inside out, but we'll be fine soon. You'll also need to account for the seam allowance. Ideally, the lines should form an X a 1/4 inch from the edge. That's where they should be connecting. If the lines touch each other right at the edge, they will appear majorly off after sewing. Back at the sewing machine, stitch the entire length with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I use a walking foot for most projects, and there's a separate video explaining why I love it. Press the seam open, and it's easier if you place something like a sleeve roll underneath. Notice how my line placement is pretty spot on. It should look like the lines are straight right on that seam line. We're almost done. See how I've created a tube of fabric with one continuous line I can cut. and it's all going to be on the bias. This last part was tedious, but I wanted to cut very carefully in order to produce a uniform strip with an accurate 2-inch width. When you get to the end, that bit of extra is just naturally cut off. Bias tape is often used in sewing and quilting projects to bind curved edges, as cutting fabric on the diagonal makes it slightly stretchy. You can use strips cut on the cross grain or selvage to selvage for straight lines like binding a rectangular quilt. I started off with a 25-inch square of fabric and ended up with 8 yards in 23 inches, or 311 inches of 2-inch bias tape. That's totally crazy. Really impressed with this method of creating bias tape, and it didn't take forever. Quite a few of the supplies featured in this video are available in my Etsy shop linked below, and be sure to check out more of my beginner sewing videos. Thanks for joining me on this episode of The Sewing Report. I'm Jen, and remember, whatever you're doing, make it fun.